Chapter 271, Networking. Chris. Sadly, no, this won't be our last run-in with them, Ryan said. It is also a problem that two separate summonings happen back-to-back in a relatively short amount of time. If it's happened twice in 2 years just in our area, it will continue to be a problem indefinitely. I could only agree with his assessment, as that was the same as I thought. People would continue to be selfish and continue to summon demons. There was nothing we could do to stop it. Being powerless to stop it was annoying. It wasn't often that powerlessness was something I felt. Not anymore. So what is it you ask of me? I asked. You didn't go through all this and not ask something of me. He already hinted at joining this coalition. It was something I was amenable to, but that depended on what it was for. If it was strictly for fighting demons and standing together against such a threat, that was perfect, but I doubted that would be all. Just like everything before, good ideals would be saddled down and corrupted with greed. Most of this is to get the word out. Awareness of the problem is half the battle, he said. It's also to get agreements to face the threat together. Those two were our main goals. I sensed a but coming. But I was right. We're also working on a solution to the problem. He let the words hang. Research and knowledge is difficult to discover, but in the 2 years since the change, we've made some advancements towards puzzling it out. That being said, to stop the summonings and track any demons that do make it to our world, we're working on a formation. Obviously, such a formation has to be massive and require an impossible amount of mana to power if it's to work over any significant distance. That much was obvious. My studies into formations was mostly on wards and not scrying formations, as what he described sounded like, but I knew enough that such a formation would be impossible to power. A large detection formation tuned into demonic mana was an expensive endeavor. Even without the crystal mine giving compact mana in solid form, we'd at most be able to cover the surrounding 100 or so miles around wherever the formation was placed. It would also be incredibly difficult to engrave, let alone maintain. That amount of power would degrade the materials quickly and require either sturdy, expensive metals as filigree or constant maintenance. Which is where the coalition comes in, Ryan said enthusiastically. Instead of one massive formation, we've theorized that a series of smaller, connected formations would be much easier to sustain and power while also covering more ground. What he was asking of me fell into place after hearing that. And you want me to place one of these formations in my city? I asked. Ryan nodded. Yes, we're trying to expand our coverage and we're reaching out to all the pylons we can. Your city being as far north as it is gives coverage over an area others can't. I was hesitant. The idea was good. Great, even if it gave us an early warning system on demon summonings, but it was also an easy way to spy on us depending on what the formation did. I'd have to study the runes involved and make sure the formation did what they said it did. I would also make it myself instead of letting anyone come in and do it. There was too much I didn't know about formations to trust it to anyone else where they could sneak something in and hide it among the runes. I see nothing wrong with doing so. I'll have to look at the formation and make it myself, but I otherwise agree. I announced. I'll have someone get in touch after this test is over, if we still stand. Great, Ryan said. We'll await you then. The conversation naturally over, I stood. Good day and good luck. I wish you good fortune in the battle to come. Likewise. With that I left. Ashton. He sat silently as he watched the Prime Minister settle back into his chair. The meeting hadn't gone horribly, which was a good sign. Could have ended a lot worse. He still remembered what happened after the demon fight vividly. He's more hard-headed than you described, Ryan said finally. I don't have that much contact with him. I've met him twice before now and neither time for very long. Ashton answered. The letters back and forth between them didn't amount to much. It was hard to understand a person through the written word. You were right about the straightforward approach, though, Ryan mused. He didn't seem to like being questioned about the portal. From what we know, he takes his word very seriously. If he said it happened, insinuating that it didn't is a direct challenge to his honor. Ashton tried to explain. With the trade between the two cities, gaining exposure to the culture of Frostheim was rather easy. Ashton also had a few informants inside, but they didn't get very far before they were stalled. Chris kept most higher positions inside his family, and that was impossible to get information on. Without someone high up on the inside, they gained the same amount of information as someone who visited normally. He didn't have the resources to do much else as his own city was in turmoil. He had to leave a lot of good men at home to make sure no riots broke out. He also had to bring a lot of people he didn't want to with him on this trip, to keep them from doing something while he was gone. Ryan straightened himself. "Do you think he will help?" Ashton nodded. "If he said he will, he will." "Good," Ryan said. "Better than the rest of these power-hungry warlords. The Stormbringer wouldn't even entertain a meeting. The bastard." An attendant came in after seeing Christopher out. "Let's keep going. Who do we have up next?" Ryan called out. "The Eternal Flame faction is next closest, followed by the Great Lakes Alliance." The attendant said. "Chris, the meeting didn't end up taking that much time out of the day, and it wasn't long until he was back to my original plans. Hauling boulders around wasn't the most entertaining thing in the world, but that was the best thing my time could be spent on. The ticking clock was a motivator unlike anything else. Watching people work tirelessly to construct weapons of war and whatever defenses they could was a sight to behold. Siege weapons took shape nearly as fast as the walls did. Every faction took a different angle depending on what their leaders thought was the best use of the time remaining. Some dug deep trenches and focused on traps instead of heavy fortifications. Those usually had an increased number of catapults to go with, focusing on high-powered offense to offset the loss of better defense. Especially those who had ranks of shield warriors to stand at the front. They believed a mass of shields would be their wall and instead spent their efforts elsewhere. Others did the exact opposite, spending all their time making the strongest and most fortified wall they could, forgoing nearly everything else. We did a mix of both. The fact we had two factions worth of builders and workers helped diversify where our time was spent. Working together increased efficiency, and our wall of stone grew with every passing hour. Earth mages worked to pull up stone from the ground and compact it down as best they could. They also worked to meld standalone boulders and chunks of stone that the warriors brought into the wall instead of leaving them as unconnected chunks. Builders did what they could and shaped it into a steadfast wall. Their skills working overtime to solidify and imbue the materials with strength. Anyone with an earth law was asked to do what they could. Every time my spirit recovered, I would come back and pour more into the wall and instill upon it my conviction. Stand strong and endure. Allison led those with trap skills into doing what they could. Connor brewed up foul poisons to make them even more effective before we left, and barrels of it were being liberally used where it could. The entire effort reminded me of the tutorial. Feels like it was so long ago. The memories felt like a time long past rather than just 2 years. Back then, we were scrambling to put up whatever defense we could before the next wave came. It was ironic we were on the same 3-day timer. History loved cycles. Except this time, instead of a rough family of 30 thrown into a situation they were unprepared for, it was a faction of thousands working at what they knew and were experienced in. Wall building was something we'd done for years back home. Nearly every participant who came south with us spent time hauling stones or working as a part of the construction crew. That experience helped us now, and work was speedy and efficient. There were a few other faction leaders that came by for one reason or another, but now wasn't the time to focus on them. If all went well, we'd have all the time in the world to sit down and discuss whatever they wished after this was over. If they were still alive. Not that I would do that, as some came off poorly already. Still, in just a few days I'd either written, talked, or otherwise spoken to more factions than I knew existed before we left Frostheim. Abigail took care of most of the networking, but I still had to be there for some of it. Initial meetings and all. It was hard not to see the progress other factions made for their sections. What started as a ring of poorly constructed wood-reinforced dirt humps turned into something more as thousands went to work. Subtle construction differences between one section to the next. Differences in height. Differences in thickness. Some had wide walkways on their top while others didn't. One section wasn't perfectly the same as another, but instead of taking away from the final form, it somehow added to it in my head. It spoke to a unity that I doubted would come often. It was on the last day that something changed. Jayla, the leader of Mountainside, had come to pay a visit. My job was mainly over. The overabundance of warriors we had compared to the number of builders made us gather more than could be used. It also gave those who needed it enough time to rest before their bodies would be put through a different trial the coming day. With nothing I could add anymore, I could only look on and hope it was enough. 3 days wasn't enough to saturate the stone in my spirit to its maximum, but it was the best we could do. I needed my anchor to be recharged before the fighting started. I'd felt her approach and knew that she was walking toward me before she spoke. Other than the meeting, we hadn't had much contact. Before coming here, we had a few letters exchanged and a tentative agreement to trade, but the obelisk put a pause on that. Fascinating, she said as her eyes roved over the wall. No one else had such a strong feeling of Earth as her. Not even Jonathan. I turned toward her. What's fascinating? The way she looked at it so intently was odd. The stone, she said. There's something different about it. Sturdier, but not through magic. Does she not know about anchors? Anyway, she tore her eyes away from our wall. I've come to offer my assistance, but it doesn't seem like you will need it. Assistance with what? I asked curiously. I knew from the meeting that she picked a section on the opposite side of us. Her, the volcano man, and the one from Denver picked together toward the west. I am a mason, she stated. Many of my city are, and we've finished our preparations early. Now we've spread out to help those who need it. That wasn't much of a surprise. We knew that Mountainside was carved out of the side of a mountain. Having a high percentage of masons was par for the course. That and miners. I appreciate the offer anyway, I said. It was a surprise to see someone so freely offering their services, but the generosity of man wasn't dead yet. Jayla smiled. I must be off, but I will seek you out after this is over to finalize our agreement. Optimistic to think we'll both survive. I didn't say that, but I certainly thought it. We said our goodbyes, and she was off to the next faction to offer her help. Entertaining so many different factions was draining. It was so much easier when we were left alone in the north. Chapter 272, Campfire Stories. All right, everyone. Great job. I clapped to get everyone's attention. Go get some rest. The time for preparing was over. What could be done was done, and only the pure crafters were left with last-minute touch-ups. They weren't participating in the fighting the following day, so they could afford to wear themselves out straight up until the timer hit 0. Some were assigned to man the siege weapons, but there were far more builders than there were slots available for that. The mood in the camp was tense. Everyone knew what tomorrow held, and that naturally raised tension levels. Most were sitting around fire pits chatting with friends, while others played games to distract themselves from the ticking clock. One only had to look up at the alien obelisk to see it. 00:15:32:12. 15.5 hours until the battle would begin. As I walked through our camp, I spotted a few people sneaking drinks that they had stashed away to calm the nerves. Beer, mead, and alcohol were all making a comeback now that the initial wave of food scarcity was evening out. We had allocated grain fields for exactly that back home in addition to the fields for food and animal feed. Some took it upon themselves to make homemade brews or fermented wines, and now that it was the night before, people were breaking open the stash. If this was before the change, leaders would throw a fit at the possibility of their army being hung over for a battle, but that wasn't really a thing anymore. Cleanse, anti-intoxication potions, and high vitality all worked to flush the system of booze much faster than before. A healer could cure both intoxication and the following hangover from being an issue, so it was easy to let people do what they wished. Everywhere I could see was doing it. The noise levels gradually rose as night descended and affairs began to get rowdier because of it. This would be their last night for some. Their last chance to do anything. Stop thinking negatively. That was another thing that became more pronounced. My thoughts turned much darker as our time ran out. It was hard not to think about how many people we would have to bury tomorrow. It brought back unwanted memories of the tutorial, where we would all go to bed before a wave wondering which of our family wouldn't be with us the next night. The feelings were similar and it was hard to push them away. Instead, I focused on the smells of campfire cooking, the sound of laughter as stories were exchanged, The good instead of the bad. My own family were sitting fireside. Austin was telling a story from his travels, but without the kids here, he kept it mostly tame and less exaggerated. He was our source of the outside world, as not many had gone out to see it. Rachel took her turn to tell her story as well, and now that I had the time, I stuck around to listen. I wandered around mostly in search of a fire treasure, she began. The map depicted something fire-related to the southeast past Old Toronto, so I headed there in hopes of finding it. She shuddered for a moment. What Austin described of the outside world didn't do it justice. People saw that I was alone and, well, the rest doesn't need to be described. Anyway, she brightened up. I came across smaller towns and small hideouts trying to sustain a safe area to live and survive. Most were welcoming and friendly, but there were some that got reduced to ashes. Bandits especially were more pronounced. That wasn't something I'd dealt with before, but now I've grown sick of them. My trip wasn't all bad as the sights were out of this world. She stopped her story for a moment and her eyes were looking at sights long past. Niagara Falls was beautiful, and that doesn't even begin to describe the Great Lakes. They're more like oceans now. They have waves that are nearly as tall. She settled back into the story. Eventually, I came across what I was looking for, but there was already a city set up around it. I wasn't the first that noticed the vibrant fire mana on the map and set out in search. That was when I found the Eternal Flame faction. Turns out, there was actually an eternal flame there before the terraforming. Austin cut in. Wait a minute. Are you telling me there was a perpetual flame before magic? That's what they said. I don't know that much about it, but there were supposedly 9 eternal flames in the world before the change. Something about natural gas flowing up and keeping a fire sustained. She answered. So it wasn't magic, but ignited gas coming up from the ground. Austin said like it was less impressive. Yes, and there were times that it'd go out and have to be relit, Rachel said. Bah! Austin scoffed. Eternal flame my ass. It's not eternal if you have to relight it. Well, it's eternal now, Rachel said smugly. It was changed to a continuous outpour of fire mana, and the flame rages like a burning bonfire constantly. It was something to look at. I may have to come take a peek. It sucks it was already discovered, but that's fine. Austin suggested. It's harder than it looks. Rachel said. They're very protective over who can see it and get close. That's understandable, Abigail jumped in. I know from Marcus's treasure. That feeling is indescribable. I felt a little left out. Our family with the water affinity got to experience it, and now so did Rachel. I wouldn't be surprised if Vinny made the trip to do the same. Those of us without those affinities were left only imagining such a feeling. I worked here and there for them, taught what I knew, killed the occasional wandering beast or rogue monster. The dungeons they had were delved constantly, so we didn't have to worry about any breaks. It took a while, but they eventually let me in to see it. Forging my core was difficult, but not overly so. After I was done, word had already spread about the obelisk, and I figured I'd meet you guys here, so I hitched a ride with them. Wait a sec, Austin said. You said before that their faction is one built on strength. Could you have barged in to see it if you wanted? Are you stronger than, what's her name? Vanessa, and no. Rachel shook her head. By the time I got there, she'd already formed her core. She was stronger than me. It also didn't help she was already a baron. You know that for a fact? I asked. She nodded. Yes, unless everyone I spoke to was lying. She's already a baron. Austin asked a different question. Could you beat her now? Rachel thought about it for a second. I'm not sure. Probably not, but it would be close. Fighting someone with the same element is hard, and the fact we're both mages doesn't make it easier. We're both heavily resistant to fire, which makes gauging such a fight difficult. I have more control than she does, but she has more explosiveness, if that makes sense, she said. But what about your dragon bloodline? Austin asked. She actually has a dragon bloodline of her own, Rachel said. And her law is also tier 2. She hasn't refined her body that I know of, so I have the advantage there, but mages hardly rely on that. Fire types and your love for dragons. Austin muttered. Phoenixes are clearly better. If you guys are so similar, Why do you say she would win? Abigail asked, and it was a thought I had myself. Austen's mutterings were ignored. A few reasons. Many of her skills are for high single-target damage, while many of mine are spread out for more area. I still have a few that I can rely on, but she has more. I also think she has more stat points than me. Chef doesn't give the same amount of stat points as City Lord. Now that she upgraded to Baron, she'll get more than me anyway. Unless I can find a way to upgrade my profession a few times in my next evolution, she'll have the edge there. Rachel started out as a cook and had since upgraded it to chef over the years. It was a growing issue for her because she didn't like it very much. She picked it in the first place because it was something we needed during the tutorial. Changing it was on her list of things to do, but that was easier said than done. Usually, switching professions was easy. Rip the old one out and plug the new one in. It took away all the stat points achieved and was incredibly painful, but it was possible. The problem was after you evolved once or twice. Professions didn't start at H rank like our classes did. They began at G rank and evolved to F rank at level 25. They evolved a second time at level 50 to E rank. Each evolution was a chance to guide your profession in a way you desired. Like how I went from blacksmith to runic blacksmith to runesmith. Switching brought you back to the base of your rank, not all the way back to the start. For people in the F rank, that wasn't a big deal. They would only miss out on one evolution when there were plenty more to go. For people in E rank, the problem got bigger, but it wasn't that bad. One evolution and 6 skills weren't that bad to miss out on. 2 evolutions and 12 skills was larger and harder to swallow. The problem was Rachel was a bit of a perfectionist. If she was going to go through the process of switching, she wanted to do it right and go all the way back to the beginning. The only problem with that was it would take a while to catch back up. We'd gone from one fight to the next with little time for reprieve. If she went back down to 0, it would take her a few years to level all the way back up to 100. If she wanted to evolve both her class and profession at the same time, gaining the bonus, she'd be stuck at the peak of E rank for a few extra years. Plus, it required certain resources and a ritual to do. Or certain treasures instead. Things we didn't have. Her current plan was to push her chef class to 100, evolve and gain the bonus, then remove it and start from scratch. That way, she'd be able to level in D rank while also rebuilding her profession. The bonus applied to do what we called perfect evolutions only mattered for the higher ranked of the two, which in Rachel's case was her class. It was a whole different can of worms if the thing you wanted to change was your higher ranked of the two. There was also risk involved. Removing that many stat points wasn't just painful, it was potentially fatal. That was another reason that treasures were required. They eased the burden on the body and made it less traumatic. Most of that didn't matter to me because I liked my profession. It wasn't something I had to go through. Before Rachel could go on, a member of Hal's scout order came up to me. "Sir, you have a visitor," the man said. I had tried to get order members to be less formal, but I was realizing that it was an effort in futility. Hell, Sophia still called me my lord. Sir was the best I could get them to go. I was lucky bowing was easier to get rid of. "Oh," I said surprised. Most of the factions had already come by. This last one was relatively late to the punch. It was also annoying that it dragged me away from a relaxing night before our test. "Did they give a name?" I asked. "She did, sir. Tracy Strong, and she said you know her," the man stated. "Tracy's here?" She didn't strike me as someone to participate in this test. Chapter 273, Nothing Standing in My Way. Strong? I never realized that was her last name. I knew she had mentioned it at least once before, but I had forgotten. It wasn't like it was something I had to keep at the front of my brain. I hadn't even spoken to her in years. The last time was right after we returned from the tutorial and resupplied at her city during our journey north. I wonder what she wants. Here to call in her favor already? She did give us a hand during our resupply, so I technically did owe her a favor. Tracy wasn't largely put out by what she gave us, and I would only do what was reasonable. The added fact of what I did during the tutorial made me feel a touch guilty as well. It gave her some wiggle room for her ask. Still, anything too big was out of the picture. She didn't do that much for us, and it wasn't like we would have died without her aid. My tent and those of my family were surrounding our own campfire, so it wasn't hard to slip in and get it ready for guests. I'd had many in the past days, so it was already cleaned and appropriate. A table and chairs were already at the ready from the last meeting I had. "You can send her in," I told the scout, who then ducked out to go get her. When the tent flaps parted and she stepped in, she looked like a completely different person. Even though it was only 2 years, her bearing had completely changed. Never once during the tutorial did she give off a strong feeling of power. She relied on traps and the men around her to survive. That had changed. She wasn't at my level, nowhere close really, but she was up there, about Ashton's level. It seems she's been working on herself. It wasn't only the subtle power she now held that was different. She held herself confidently. Her head was high and her clothes stood out against the rest of the people here. Not as fancy to describe them as regal, but well-made and expensive if they were to be sold. Her hair was shorter than I remembered, only reaching her shoulders but without being put up in any way. Her face was smiling, but it hid a weariness I couldn't put my finger on. She seemed tired, drained, and not from recent activities. "Tracy, it's been a long time," I said. "That it has, Christopher." She sat down at my offered chair. "I didn't expect to see you here. This doesn't seem like your type of scene." It was the polite way to put it in my mind. Our latest intel, which was wildly out of date, put her as an arcane trapper as her class, but that was her F-rank class. I had no idea what she'd evolved into or what her skills were now. I couldn't afford not to come, not only for the connections, but to steal some essence. A small smile appeared. "It's too big to miss out on, but not to worry. I won't be staying. My traps are set and there's little else I can add that other people can't. I'll be making a swift retreat with all the crafters, builders, and opportunistic merchants that came around." That was more like it. She'd plant some traps to accrue some participation and gain some levels, but stay far in the back to mitigate risk. That was how I expected her to act, but the new strength she had hinted that she was changing. With greetings out of the way, "Why are you here, Tracy?" "Ah, it's good to see some things haven't changed. I imagine you're worn out from everyone wanting to meet you." I didn't even have to nod, as she already knew I was. Most are just going around and feeling out all the factions. The conversations end when they realize I want no part in what they're selling. I answered, "The winds are changing. That much is obvious." Tracy said, "What do you think will happen when this is all over?" I sighed. I didn't want to talk about this. It was brought up repeatedly and it was something my family discussed, but I still didn't like it. "By your face, I can tell you already know," Tracy said. "Everyone came out of the tutorial to ruins. The first year they were scrambling to get their feet under them. Some couldn't find sure footing and their efforts failed. Others found themselves. After that, the second year was securing that footing, building up walls and cities to protect themselves. Now, with the home front secured, their eyes turn elsewhere. I've seen it already. The only reason more wars haven't kicked off is because of this test." There was a heat in her voice that portrayed that she liked it as much as I did, which was none at all. "If you came to warn me, I already know," I said sadly. "After this test was over, things would go downhill." Tracy nodded. "I wanted to make sure. I saw where you settled on a map, and by God you couldn't get any further north." She chuckled. "How long did that take you?" 8 months. "Geez, when you said you were going north, I didn't think you would go that far." She commented, "Still, being that far away gives you an advantage. I'm in the thick of things and I had to come and see where things were going. My city depends on it." "You've got Nick, don't you?" "I met him, by the way." "You've met him? So you see where my troubles are." Tracy sighed. "He's mainly the reason I came. He was gearing up to claim more land before this obelisk was found. I've seen his plans. He aims to build his own empire. He seemed like the type. He won't be the only one." I said, "Are you worried he'll drag you into something you don't want?" She looked around the tent before answering. "I'm not sure. He's left me mostly alone once he left. He hasn't been back since moving to Storm City. As long as I send him his taxes on time, he leaves me to do what I want. It's the other factions I worry about. I meet with them often and try to impress upon them to not lump me in with him, but there's only so much I can do since we're both in the same faction. Do you regret choosing him to serve under? I asked. When she left the tutorial, she said her goal was to look for someone to play the leader while she got to run her city and push the blame onto him. It seemed like she bit off more than she could chew. Instead of someone who had a lot of strength and wanted to be a leader without doing the work, she got someone who wanted to build an empire. I'm not sure, she said. Only time will tell. It isn't like there's anyone else who is better. It isn't just Nick that's looking to expand. I don't know whether to be happy or sad that I don't think he will lose. Is he a baron? I asked. Yes, I was there when he did the upgrade. It was one of the few times he called me back, she said. If that's so, and from how strong he feels, then yes, I don't think he will lose. I said. Not unless he goes up against one of the other barons. How many other barons are there? I wasn't able to go to the meeting, she asked. I know of 2 others for a fact. Marcus, the man I arrived with who runs what used to be Minneapolis, and Vanessa. She runs a city in eastern New York called the Eternal Flame Faction, but there are a few others I suspect. I've heard of both of those, she said. Have you met the leader of the Great Lakes Alliance? I asked. Patrick Stafford's was the closest person I suspected of being a baron to where Tracy's city stood. Tracy looked confused. Which one? What do you mean? There's only one leader I saw at the meeting, and he introduced himself as the leader of the faction. I questioned. There are multiple leaders. They started as individual factions but came together to form an alliance against the lake monsters. The beasts that come from them are stronger than normal. Tracy dropped insider knowledge like it was nothing. I didn't even know where his city, Harbor Deep, was located. Well, I don't know about the other ones, but I suspect that he's a baron. There are 2 in the New Orleans area, but that's pretty far from you. The rest are equally as far. I continued. There's also the possibility that there is a baron out there that didn't come. I highly doubt that. Tracy said. I haven't heard of any big hitters near me that aren't here. Unless they're really good at hiding, I think this is all of the major factions this side of the mountains. I wouldn't know, I said. I hadn't heard of most of the factions here. Here, take this, Tracy said and handed over what looked to be an innocuous bag. I can't stay here long and I don't want Nick to get suspicious. I've visited all the other factions for the same amount of time so as to not draw attention. She seemed a little flustered and that made me confused. Did you not tell him you know me? I asked. No, I told no one. Those who saw us meet after the tutorial don't know who you are and most don't remember. We've had a lot of visitors since then, she said. Why? Why keep it a secret? I asked. I want something that's mine without him getting in the way. I doubt he'd ever want to go far north as to conquer you, but if he does, I'll try to dissuade him, and to do that he has to think I don't know you, she said. I'm not worried about fighting him. He may be strong, but so am I said. Oh, don't worry, you don't have to tell me that. I've seen what you can do. It's mostly for my own benefit, not yours. After passing me the bag, she got up to leave. It felt mostly empty with only a small, hard object inside it. It made me curious. What's this? A way to communicate. We're calling them messaging stones, she said. But I have to go. Take care, Chris. Take care. I was instantly intrigued by what was in the bag, but I watched her leave before opening it. Once she left, I pulled open the strings to see a crystal covered in runes inside. It was misleading to call it a stone when it wasn't, but I wasn't the one who named it. Picking it up and giving it a closer look revealed tiny, delicate runes inscribed all around the crystal. Beginner runic language gave me an indication of what they were, but that didn't reveal the entire picture. Most of the runes I knew were for protection or defense, durability or a way to deflect or absorb damage. I also knew a few offensive ones like sharpness, piercing, and penetration. The ones I was looking at now were not even close to the ones I knew. The fact they were so small also didn't help. Who in the world made this? The work was above something I could manage. I didn't have the dexterity to create something so small. The crystal had a string of multiple runes carved around it, and if I had to make something that small, I'd be hard-pressed to engrave one rune, let alone a string of them. It was exciting, but it would take more time to decipher than I could give it. I only had a few hours left before heading to rest, and I didn't want to waste them studying. I'll come back to it after. Instead, I went back to the fire and enjoyed my family's company. Everyone was feeling the weight of what tomorrow held, and it was nice to be together. It made pushing away the dark memories of the past easier. What did she want? Austin asked with a smirk. She got the hots for you? Austin, you have a gift of ruining the moment. Hey, I'm just saying. A young, fit, and beautiful lady comes calling after sundown and you host her in your tent. It was a bit quick, but I won't judge. Everyone else around the fire chuckled at his teasing. It wasn't like that. She just came to warn me. I said, warn you of what? Of what we already expect. After this obelisk is dealt with, there'll be nothing standing in the way of war. Chapter 274, or I wouldn't. The flames of the fire dwindled over the night and people broke away as the stars came out. Austin and I stayed put and watched as people returned to their tents one by one. With my endurance, I could stay up the whole night and be just fine, but it was better to be in tip-top shape. A few hours would do the trick, which gave me a lot of time to sit and contemplate. Why Austin stayed was unclear. He too had a high endurance, but I thought it was also because I was still up. The alcohol he managed to get his hands on was long gone, and it wasn't even close to enough for either of us to feel anything. A fact he complained about constantly. This is bullshit. He had to quietly complain to not wake people. It even tasted like ass too. The least it could do was get us drunk. It will get there eventually, I said. The brewers aren't as high level as us and they're still working out their craft. It also doesn't help the materials they're using aren't the highest grade. High-grade grains weren't to be wasted on making ale. Not yet, at least. We would grow our production in the coming years and that issue would be fixed. Farmers would level and get better as well as would the mana levels of the world. But for now, we were without. Mana was still on the rise and no one knew when they were going to stop. The grade our planet would end up at was still in the air. I know, but still. Not even a buzz. Austin threw another stick in the fire, which caused the coals to spark up. It's probably for the best. If high-quality booze was available, I don't even want to think about what would happen. We already have fights breaking out occasionally. We don't need drunken brawls on top of it. I said, those are half the fun. He lamented. Watching people duke it out in wild haymakers and stumbling footwork is always entertaining. You and I have different ideas of entertaining. Austin poked at the fire and I sensed him using some mana to get it to dance a little. It would have been nice to take the edge off. All this sitting and waiting without anything to do. A burst of frost extinguished the flame he was playing with and he gave me a snide look. We'll have enough action to deal with tomorrow. Some peace and quiet now is good, I said. Austin smirked. Have you thought about what you're going to say? Something cool as the timer ticks over to 0 that inspires everyone to charge into battle. I'm not one for grand speeches, I remarked. My last one wasn't the most impressive. Oh, really? Austin jumped. What did you say? The speech wasn't that long ago and I could still clearly remember the words I had said. So I told him. After saying it, he was howling on the floor, laughing his ass off. That's it, he said in between bursts of laughter. For better or worse, we marched to end the threat against us. That was the best you could come up with. Before I could defend myself, he kept going. And don't fear such an end? You basically told them to not be scared of dying. Hey, felt good in the moment and I was being truthful. Dying in the defense of one's home is an honorable way to go. Glorious even. Yeah. Honor and glory. He mocked. At least do a little better tomorrow. Thousands of people will hear you and not just those from our city. If you blunder it, people will remember. Oh, thanks, asshole. I said. No pressure or anything. I'm just saying. You have a few hours to figure it out. At least it will be better than charge at demons and don't fear dying. He started snickering again. We won't be charging anything this time, so that's already a change. We're on the defensive. I pointed out. Dear brother, this guy. Austin shook his head and muttered to the air. The fire was petering out again, but he didn't throw another log on it. Instead, he stood from his chair. All right, time to hit the hay. A man needs his beauty sleep. Good night, Austin. Night, Chris. I stayed up for a little longer looking at the stars. Glory and honor. I can work with that. 00:10:52:43. The atmosphere when I awoke was completely different from the one I fell asleep to. It was quiet, serene even the previous night, and now it was no better than a circus. Cooking, last-second Smith work, voices talking over one another. With so many people, it was a lot to wake up to. Thank God for Gabriel and his noise cancellation. His enchantments were a godsend in this environment. It wasn't until I opened my tent and stepped out that the sound slammed into me. It wasn't just the sound that was different, people were twitchy. It was easy to spot as most were terrible at hiding it. I checked the timer to see where we were. 00:03:06:32. Just over 3 hours. There was still enough time for last-minute additions, but I had everything I needed. My armor wasn't in need of any repairs and my weapon was in fine condition. The defenses we had set up were to the best of our ability. There was nothing for me to do. My resource pools were all filled to the brim and I could feel the air around me chill from the Arctic mana leaking out. Everyone was leaking something as no one wanted to go into battle with anything less than filled to the brim. It was an odd sensation to feel. All the various affinities combining together from everyone in the area. It was also an easy way to tell how much mana regeneration someone had that I'd never noticed before. I rarely kept my mana filled like I was now. It wasn't perfect. People had ways to obscure it or they could circulate it in their bodies instead of letting it billow out freely, but it was enough for a rough estimate. Mages were easy to spot over their warrior counterparts. There were veritable seas of mana gushing out of them compared to the trickles and streams of those more dedicated to the physical side. People's affinities were also clear in the mana that leaked out of them. Not that an affinity was hard to figure out. Watching someone fight would instantly reveal what their affinity was. The mana density was also a stark difference. It went from being somewhat sparse, with everyone using up the ambient mana on skills or spells of some sort, to being thick in the air as people generated more than they used. The insane number of people in one area only exacerbated the issue. Not that more mana was a bad thing, but I knew it wouldn't last. As soon as the first spells started flying and the battle began in earnest, the mana would be sucked from the air much faster than it could be replenished. The only reason the density was so high now was because people had nothing to spend their mana on. All the different affinities also played havoc on the weather. The sky looked like it could go 4 different ways simultaneously. A rainstorm looked just as likely to break out as the shining sun. Breakfast was kept light for a few reasons. No one wanted to fight on a full stomach and we were running light on excess food. We picked more up when we resupplied at the Twins, but there was only so much food to go around. We still had to make it back and the river was flowing in the wrong direction to aid us in our return. Waiting was the hardest part. Our meal was quick and there wasn't much else to do. The minutes dragged and being able to literally count them down only made it worse. It was odd to see so many people leaving. The merchants who only came to make a quick buck were the first to leave. Some stayed for last-minute sales, but the majority were eager to put some distance between them and what was to come. The non-combatants were next. The builders, engineers, and other construction workers retreated to the other side of the river and stayed in the city there. It was a bit of a bummer I wasn't able to visit the city, but I hoped there would be time afterward. There was a massive river between the city and the obelisk and most hoped that it would be enough. The over 200,000 people also allayed people's fears. I'd never been to St. Louis and it was disappointing to see that the arch was destroyed. The saddest part was the fighters that snuck out. Cowardice came for some and they made the choice to leave rather than stay and fight. Everyone who came south with me were volunteers. They knew what we were getting into, so we didn't have many, but we still had a handful. No group was immune to the basic human trait of fear and cowardice, no matter how much I disdained it. Some factions were hit harder than others, but we didn't have the scouts or intelligence to get a perfect count. Nor was it the best use of our time. All scouts were called back from their espionage to stand ready. 00:00:59:59. As the timer ticked under an hour, people started strapping up. Plate armor was pulled on and strapped tight. Leather that had been lovingly oiled the night previously was seeing the sun. Weapons were given the final once-over. Prayers were whispered. The last one was funny to me, but I wouldn't disparage anyone of their tradition. Even some of my family still prayed even though I found it doubtful. I didn't get to watch long as I had to gear up myself. My plate armor was completely remade from the fight with the demons. It was with the finest steel I could make. Mana infusion worked over multiple weeks to push the metal into an even higher grade, and the base material was already pulled from the 9th floor of the dungeon. It took months of running both dungeons to get enough of the same metal, and weeks longer to use mana infusion, but it all added together for the finest work I could produce. Even though Vincent was a better smith than me, even he couldn't do better than what I had forged. He couldn't work with cold-aligned metals as well as I could. Arctic iron combined with frozen coal to make polar steel. The metal was rigid and extremely hard. The only downside was its brittleness. When it broke, it shattered, which wasn't the best to use for armor, but I had ways around that. Took learning a new rune, but it was worth it. I usually put a frost rune, a durability rune, and a protection rune on my armor, as those were the best 3 I could use, but I changed it up this time. The durability and protection runes stayed, as those were both important for its defense, but the frost rune was swapped for a ductile one. The metal itself was already cold-aligned, and it had a smooth transfer with my mana as it was already accustomed to it because of mana infusion. So instead, I chose to remedy a weakness rather than to push for a better connection to cold. The plates were thick. The joints had to be done in a different material, but that was fine. Frost armor would add a bit of protection where the material fell short. The chest plate settled onto my shoulders comfortably, as I had tweaked it endlessly to get the fit right. The straps fastened tight, and no amount of movement was going to cause it to slide around. The legs were harder, as there were a lot more straps involved, but I'd suited up enough times for it to become effortless. My feet came first as I worked from the ground up. Greaves to cover the top of my feet and lower legs. Separated plates that encased my thighs came next before they were covered up with a heavy skirt. I made sure everything was connected not only to my body securely, but to each piece as well so there were no gaps. My pauldrons came next, as moving in them was the hardest. Bending down to fasten my leg armor was difficult if I couldn't move my shoulder in the ways I needed to. I could have had help, but I liked doing this alone. It had turned into a ritual of sorts. Doing it every morning before venturing into the dungeons left me with a lot of time to get comfortable moving through the motions. It didn't help that I didn't like leaving something this important to others. Vambraces were last as they strapped on easiest. I usually didn't wear armor past my shoulder, but this was a rare occasion. Losing an arm had made me reconsider their viability. It got in the way of swinging my hammer, but heavy armor proficiency helped mitigate that. There was another piece of armor that was new for much the same reason. My helmet. It was nothing as bulky as a bucket helmet, but it did encase my head in metal, unlike how I fought before. Nearly getting my head torn off and losing an eye to the demon made me reconsider that piece of armor as well. That fight had done a lot to make me rethink how well armored I went into battle. This fight, this test, was mainly defensive. The choice to forego arm and head armor was mainly so I could swing my hammer more comfortably and swiftly. I traded that for more defense this time. I trained fighting with it so I wasn't going into a battle with new armor, but it still wasn't as comfortable as before. An upgrade to heavy armor proficiency would fix that, but I hadn't pushed it past journeyman yet. I gave myself a once-over. I looked ready for war. I grabbed my hammer and fastened it to my back before tucking my helmet under one arm. I did not pray. I did not wish for luck. I did not beg fortune to favor me. Everything that happened today would be because I made it happen. Or it would be because I couldn't make it happen. I would be standing at the end of the day. Or I wouldn't. Chapter 275 Stand Tall. 00:00:21:01. I stood atop our wall and watched as thousands of people fell into ranks. Over 800 people stood at the ready at my back, and Marcus had even more standing behind him to our south. The area between the ringed wall and the obelisk was filled with all manner of death traps and poisons. Pitfalls, spikes, arcane traps, all covered in thick layers of poison where it was applicable. Carpenters to shape the wood used, smiths to shape the metal, trappers to set it all up, and alchemists to make it even more deadly. It was the union of 5 or 6 different people, all to ensure it was at maximum lethality. And there were thousands of them primed and ready. The wall itself was devoid of any towers or gates, as there wasn't enough time for the former, and there was no need for the latter. One didn't need gates to keep something out. The weather only worsened as the timer ticked down, but I paid it no mind. With the amount of magic about to be used, the weather was the least of our worries. A heavy rainstorm or thunderstorm might actually be useful, rather than harmful. Thousands of gallons of water were diverted from the river in a hastily built canal. Both Marcus and Abigail worked together to create the reservoir for them and the other water mages to use. With it at our back, all the water mages would be a lot more powerful. And ice would be readily available for all those who used it. When the sun did come out, it shined brightly upon the thousands covered in plate. Reflections lit up the area because of the glistening metal, and the solar mana continued to gather. Austin would have his own boost. Thousands upon thousands stood awaiting the arrival of our challenge. It only took a turn of the head and more of the sea of men and women would be revealed. 00:00:12:25. Siege weapons created a second ring behind the wall. Dozens were built and assembled by nearly every faction, adding up to hundreds, creating a second ring. Catapults and trebuchets creaked under the tension they were under. All of them were ready to unload at a moment's notice. 00:00:08:42. Men and women with bows stood multiple ranks deep. Hundreds of thousands of arrows were created just for this moment. Every person had a stack set aside next to them, so they had enough for what was to come. 00:00:05:01. Leaders began to inspire who they could. Speeches about fighting for humanity or stepping up. Every leader was different. Every faction drew inspiration from however they could. "It's time to nut up or shut up," Austin joked and gave me a thumbs up. "Knock 'em dead." He and Jonathan both stood at my side like normal. Elliot was up here with us as well, along with a few other warriors. I sighed deeply before quickly regaining my confidence. To get everyone's attention, I sent a burst of cold through the area. A light application of desolate blizzard was enough to draw everyone's eyes. Or maybe it was unleashing my aura. Members of Frostheim, we stand at the ready to face our challenge. Thousands of miles were covered so that we could stand here right now and face what's thrown at us. Whatever comes through that obelisk, it will break upon our walls. It will break upon our swords and shields. It will break because we will stand here and make it break. There are 2 things every man, woman, and child should hope to accomplish in life. 2 things that set us apart from everyone else. It isn't our power or strength. It isn't our pride or ego. It is our hearts. It takes heart to stand tall while others cower. It takes heart to fight while others flee. But most of all, it takes heart to live with honor and fight for those who cannot. In addition to heart, it takes a determined will. Having heart may lead you to where you stand today, but having a determined will is why you remain. Everyone saw those slinking off in the night, those who left when the time for battle came near. Yet here you stand. I can see the determination burning in your eyes. Determination that even the threat of death can't extinguish. Not only determination, but the willpower to charge into battle knowing death is possible. Knowing that this may be your end. Yet here you stand. The determination to die with glory. Those 2 things are what set you apart from everyone else. Those 2 things are why you and I are here today. When the sun sets on this day, those are the only 2 things that will matter. And if death comes for you today, and this fight is to be your last, those that remain will remember you. They will carry you with them for as long as they live. The memory and legacy that you forge today will be something no one here will forget. Because it will be glorious. An end that people can only dream of. An end fit for those who go out and grasp with their bare hands. An end fit for kings. A grand cheer broke out from everyone listening. Weapons were raised in the air and shaken in response to my own. After it died down, I wrapped it up. We stand here today and we will not be found wanting. Ah! Everyone added their voice to the cheer and the noise was near deafening. The fervor was enough to put a smile on my face. 00:00:00:49. I hadn't timed it, but it ended up perfect. Just enough time for everyone to close ranks, but not too long the vim and vigor died off. The energy in the air was palpable. I stood proud, my blood chilling in excitement and anticipation. As every leader whipped their people into motion, as the thousands here readied themselves, a weight settled on everyone here. A weight that comforted instead of stifled. It was the collective weight of everyone here. As everyone let it out, their auras mixed and collided, but instead of fighting for dominance or smothering each other, it was all pointed in one direction. It was the first time I had ever seen such a phenomenon, and it was beautiful. All of our efforts pointed in the same direction. The weather took a turn and I swore I felt a drizzle begin to fall. But no rain came. With my speech finished, I leaped off the wall and landed in the dead zone, and a thud. Austin, Jonathan, and Elliot followed after along with those who were willing. Austin just had to have the last laugh and landed next to me with a smile. It was no King Theoden, but it still was good. I liked how you weaved live with honor, die with glory in there. It's easy to inspire what I already believe in, I said and slammed my helmet down and made sure it was snug. Austin did the same next to me, his eyes sparkling through the eye holes. Next came the ice. My mana, spirit, and law infused into frost armor, and it settled over my armor perfectly. Thick sheets of hard-pressed ice settled and froze into place, and I wasn't the only one applying an extra layer of armor. Jonathan had earth flowing up from the ground and hardening onto his form. Elliot shifted the layers of metal around him into a suit of armor that encased him in inches of the stuff. He looked more like a walking tank than a person in a suit of armor. He was going full defensive for this battle, and I couldn't blame him. Only Austin was left out, and he could only tisk in shame as everyone else pulled their elements around them. I swung my hammer around lightly to make sure everything fit into place. The ice melded with the polar steel, creating a flowing set better than both sets apart. Those who jumped down with me did the same. Even Austin did some practice stabs to make sure he was ready. 00:00:00:05. Archers and Osike, called. I couldn't see them, but I could hear their synchronized movement. The sound of bowstrings tightening and wood creaking. 00:00:00:00:00. Defend your obelisk. The timer hit 0 and doors no one knew where they're opened. All four sides of the obelisk ground open and things started to pour out. Thousands began rushing out of the tower as every side was dozens of feet wide. Before I could even recognize what we were up against, traps began exploding left and right. Those placed closest to the obelisk were set off first, but more and more began blowing up to add to the noise. Austin, what are we up against? I called. I couldn't make anything out, but he could. A flash of light came from him before he responded. It says, Blight touched orc. What level? All of them are level 100. Explosions continued to rattle the battlefield as 3 days' worth of traps tried to slow down the tide. It was a losing cause. For every orc that fell to a trap, dozens more came pouring out of the obelisk, and only one of them were finite. Hundreds died in the first few seconds from our preparations alone. In the times in between clouds of dust and smoke, I could make out the monsters pouring out dozens at a time. The orcs themselves were disfigured. The tall, muscled green skin that orcs usually were thought of was long gone. They were still tall and extremely well-muscled, but their skin was different. Instead of rich green, they had streaks of black running through them or splotches covering sections of their body. The vibrant green the first expected to see from orcs was instead sickly and dull. The orcs ran through row after row of traps, and the area around the obelisk became drowned in bodies. The circle of death only expanded as more traps were expended or arrows from other sections were launched. Loose, I called. A wave of arrows rained down and even more orcs fell. Thousands of arrows came flying down in the volley, which was unreliant on our numbers. Skills like splitting arrow or arrow rain turned what would have been a volley of hundreds into a volley of thousands. The carpet of arrows only gave a small reprieve. It wasn't long before the wave of orcs made it back to where they had left off. Without traps to slow them down, it was only moments before they were pushed forward again. Trebuchets, fire. Large chunks of rock came raining down next as our dozens of siege weapons fired. Row after row of charging orcs were flattened or crushed as the projectiles were designed to hit and roll through rank after rank of them. The angle was meticulously measured to make sure the weapons were most effective. Still, like the arrows, the effect was minimal. Mages, fire. A sea of spells rained down next containing so much mana it was hard to look at. Felt like staring at the sun but for my mana sense. Fire exploded. Lightning boomed. Earth and ice came raining down in droves. Some of the spells persisted, turning into a field of fire or thick rows of roots and thorns pulled whipping back and forth. It still wasn't enough to stop the orcs' advance. Fire at will. As the orcs closed in, I wouldn't be able to command the ranged units for much longer. I'd have my hands full with something else. Time to put in the work. Austin flashed even brighter as light started escaping him. The test began right at noon, which couldn't have come at a more perfect time for him. He was at his most powerful right now, and he was aiming to make the best use of it. His spear came alight, and he started stabbing out in quick succession, launching skills of his own. The warriors with long-range skills followed suit along with the rogues with throwing weapons. Row after row of orcs went down, but more and more came spilling out. It was impossible to miss, there were so many. Finally, when the orcs came into my range, I began. Permafrost and desolate blizzard drank in my mana, and momentarily, summer was banished and winter reigned. I flared my bloodline for an initial boost but quickly let off to save it for later. We had no way of knowing what would come next. Could be an endless row of orcs, or there could be champions mixed in. We wouldn't know until they arrived. Still, with summer turned to winter and my skills turning the area around me arctic, it was finally my turn to face the charging orcs. Now that they were close enough, I could make out more of what I faced. Hal was right in that they were carrying weapons. Most had axes of some kind while others had clubs. The rare orc held a sword, but those were few and far between. Some even had hammers, but by far axes were most popular. They were primitive in make. Some were even hewed from bone instead of forged from metal. Rust was common on the rare metallic weapon, as were chips and slight fractures. The weapons could use a resurfacing, but they were deadly enough. The muscled arms that held them aloft made it so. Their skin may be sickly, but it seemed they still retained their strength. As the front of the wave neared enough to our defensive line, the fight began in earnest. My hammer met the first of their number, and its face crushed in from the blow. Mighty blow turned its skull to fragments, and it fell listlessly forward as its momentum forced it to go in a direction its head didn't follow. The next was embedded upon the spike before it too joined its brethren in death. Momentum of the avalanche started to build to match the bodies at my feet. Jonathan and Elliot stood at my side while Austin danced around the battlefield, stabbing out when the opportunity arose. With command delegated, Hal and Abigail both took charge of the archers and mages respectively. Vinny and Braden remained in Frostheim, so command of the siege weapons was left to Philip. He stayed to fight even though his fighting capability was poor. It doesn't take skill with a sword to launch some boulders, the builder claimed. An axe landed upon my armor of ice and barely left a scratch. It was filled with everything I could give it, and not even a level 100 orc could cause it to shatter. But for some reason, that didn't make me feel good. This was our test. It determined if we kept our protections or not. It shouldn't be so easy that my armor was impenetrable. Took a second for me to realize the problem. None of the orcs were using skills. Chapter 276, Chaos of Nature. Why aren't they using skills? I'd never fought orcs before, but I'd fought something close. Both goblins and hobgoblins were sent against us occasionally during the monthly waves. Or bi-monthly now that we upgraded our pylon. The distance of time lengthened for some reason we still weren't sure about. Goblins used skills. Hobgoblins used skills, but for some reason these orcs weren't. Is it the blight? Did getting infected take away the ability to use skills? But that didn't make any sense. I could feel the mana moving in their bodies. It was disgusting, horrendous, distasteful mana that had been corrupted by the blight, but it was still mana. It moved through their bodies like any other kind of mana, but it just wasn't being used for skills. I didn't get long to think about it before I was entrenched in battle. Our usual strategy of facing hordes was employed. Those willing stood in front of the wall to blunt the impact while everyone else held it. I was in my usual position at the vanguard, and that meant I was the first person the wave broke against, which always made my job the hardest. But there was nowhere else I wanted to be. The orcs were at the peak of E-grade, only one level away from D-grade. Their fighting strength was significantly lower than that due to not using skills, but their numbers more than made up for it. It didn't take long until I was drenched in brackish blood. The dark red, nearly black blood certainly didn't look healthy. It gave off a feeling of dread as well. The feeling reminded me of the unnaturalness that the demons gave off, but on an entirely new level. This wasn't just unnaturalness, this was anathema. After the first few went down to my hammer, their blood coated my weapon and my armor. It stuck to it and coagulated quickly from the cold, but not before eating away at it. It burrowed in like acid. Wherever it landed on the ground began to sizzle as well, destroying anything living. Plants withered and died within seconds. Don't get the blood on you. The blood is acid. The call of alarm was from everyone currently facing the orcs in battle. Some were already screaming from the splatter that coated bare skin. I was lucky my ice kept it from my skin. Instead, it was a constant drain on my mana to keep frost armor intact. The blood ate away at not only the ice but the mana used to make it. I did not want to feel what it was like on bare skin if the screams were anything to go off of. Some were already retreating back to the wall seeking help from healers. I had to push the sounds of screaming away and focus on what was in front of me. With the orcs not using skills, it meant I could keep things in reserve for when the challenge increased. There was no way that this would be all that was thrown at us. No way. Righteous fury would be kept sheathed, and so would my bloodline. I had to use my spirit to reinforce frost armor. But other than that, I saved it. We had no idea how long the obelisk would continue to disgorge the blight. Relying solely on strength of arm and the least amount of mana I could, I slaughtered as many as possible. I trusted my weapon, but the growing thickness of taint on the hammerhead was worrying. It was my legendary skill, and it was powerful, but I had no way of knowing if the blight was more powerful in the long run. The ice the head was made of was fine, but I couldn't be sure it would continue to be. Stop getting in your own head. Focus. Avalanche was slowly building, and I needed less and less strength to rend the orc's limb from limb. It wasn't my intention to create such a gory sight, but my hammer swinging around as fast as it was made it impossible to hold back. There was no slowing this train once it got in motion, and it was well and truly in motion. To ration my mana, I stopped using skills other than Frost Amore. Mighty Blow wasn't necessary after my strength rose to over 2,000. Avalanche and Glacial Presence pushed it above that rather quickly. With my current stats, it would eventually rise to over 3,000, but that wouldn't be for a while. Plus, I wouldn't be able to hold it for long. That kind of boost wrecked my body to maintain. It was the reason that no boosts or blessings fell on me. Austin, Jonathan, Elliot, and every other warrior fighting were given a blessing. Either a large boost to one stat or a small boost to all of them depending on the support. Shields were also flickering in and out around them, blocking damage that I didn't have. I didn't need it. Others did. Every support or healer with a blessing or boost was told in no uncertain terms that I was not to be targeted. Settling in, I noticed how different the fight was. How often I was getting hit. How often I was having to change my approach. These aren't beasts. It wasn't claws and teeth reaching out to me. I didn't have to defend against sudden lunges from creatures with powerful hind legs. I didn't have to dance around beasts with thousands of pounds behind them. I had to watch axe heads and sword edges. I had to judge the distance of how far they could reach. It wasn't something I was used to, and I was suffering for it. Cracks spread and chunks of ice fell off. My ice wasn't breached and my skin remained unmarred, but that didn't mean it would stay that way. The habits I had formed were working against me. I had sparred and trained against other humans, but it had been years since I'd fought seriously against one. Years since, and it was against mindless thralls, not weapon masters or skilled combatants. Which these orcs were not, but they still had enough skill to press me. One-on-one, it would be a slaughter, but that wasn't because I outskilled them. It was because I was stronger and had more stat points. A certain amount of strength made skill meaningless. But that didn't mean they couldn't wear me down. I needed to be more efficient. Less wasted movement. I didn't need to exert 2,000 points of strength to completely pulverize one orc when a light tap would cave in its chest and kill it anyway. Axe strikes didn't need to be avoided, but they needed to be spread out. One hit was fine and draining a minuscule amount of mana. Multiple hits were not. Faster. My swings became wider, more arcing. I didn't need short swings, so I was ready to defend. I didn't need defense at all. I would do what I had taught, trust my armor. I felt myself become smoother. Felt as the changes brought by humanoid enemies were made nearly subconsciously. The death toll at my feet climbed. The piles of dead turned into mountains. Every once in a while, a spell or powerful arrow slammed down next to me and blew them apart, but it wasn't long until the pile started to build again. Orcs died, lost their fight against my skills, and froze solid. My feet trampled what was left into the ground, or when the occasion arose, shattered them. The bodies of the fallen turned into shrapnel to kill even more. It was gruesome, grotesque even, but I did it all the same. I spoke the words earlier because I meant them. They would break upon our walls, and they would break upon us. I was so involved with making sure I killed as many as possible I didn't see the attack coming in. I'd been lulled into normalcy, and maybe that was the point. The horde hadn't been charging at us for long, but it had been long enough. An arrow. One I didn't see coming. One I didn't expect to see coming. Shattered the ice around my leg. The bone tip didn't make it farther than that, and the shaft exploded into splinters of wood. But it was enough to stagger me slightly. I whipped my head up and saw an orc much taller than the rest standing with a ruinous-looking bow. It looked like it was hewed from a full tree rather than a branch. The orc pulled out an identical arrow before nocking it. Its muscles bulged and strained to pull the massive string back, but its efforts were worth it as the arrow was launched. It sped through the air faster than I could track before impacting the same spot. The ice that had just begun growing back was shattered for the second time, and the metal armor under it was dented. "Austin, what is that?" I shouted the words, and they intertwined with my aura. It was wild and flaring now that the battle was heated, and they merged together seamlessly. I knew he heard me because I knew everyone in range heard me. "Orc hunter. Can't see its level." His answer came swiftly. "I'll take care of it." He left out blight-touched because that much was obvious. Being unable to see its level almost certainly meant D-rank. The power packed into its arrow made that a certainty. With his reassurance, I trusted him to take care of it. I couldn't spare to watch, but the light show was hard to miss. "Warriors, be ready for ranged attacks," I called out in warning. If I was surprised, others would be too. The light died down but exploded out again in another attack. "There's more. Some are orc champions instead," Austin's voice shouted. The mountains of dead orcs were shock troops. They were sent to soften up our lines before the real threats came through. It made me wonder if this was the usual strategy for orcs or if this was something the Blight did. Send in the weak before the strong. That strategy made something inside me angry. It went against being a warrior, but I wasn't sure why I felt that way. These were monsters, it didn't matter what they did. Still, if that was their strategy and what we faced already were the weak, who were the strong? How high into D-rank would we face? Archers. Focus the champions and hunters. My order resounded out to make sure it was heard. Mages were told to fire for effect. Wide skills were better than single-target skills. Archers were more for precision and told to take down the elite targets, which the hunters and champions undoubtedly were. Spells and arrows had continued to rain down since the start. It wasn't just our section either. Every section had mages launching spells deep into enemy ranks, taking out orcs by the dozens. The way the ringed wall was set up made it so the deeper a spell was launched, the more overlap there was, but that worked in everyone's favor. It was like an unspoken agreement was reached, and each section cycled through launching powerful spells, and a rhythm was reached. Boulders rained endlessly from siege weapons. The people who manned them scrambled to reload and fire as quickly as possible. The few Earth mages stationed nearby worked overtime to pull up and compact ammo as fast as it could be fired. Those who stood upon the wall fired whatever they could into the chaos, whether that be an arrow, javelin, or conjured weapon of a different origin. Spells had been planned out in advance. Affinities accounted for to not interfere, but those plans were beginning to break down. So much magic had been used that it was all beginning to swirl together. Ice and water reigned supreme where I stood, and everything opposing that was weakened. Water dominated to our south and nature to our north. The faction that was assigned the section was run by a druid. A powerful one if the mana they were throwing around was anything to go off of. Lightning rained down in such frequency that the rumbling thunder was endless. It was only accentuated by loud cracks by powerful bolts. The sound was loud enough to carry throughout the battlefield, and I had a feeling I knew who was responsible for those that were loudest. The weather that had already been worsening turned into something completely different. The clouds darkened and unleashed thick sheets of rain in some spots, but the sun poked through in others. Wind howled through as pressure changes were altered by the second. Temperature was blistering hot in some parts and devastatingly cold in others. Snow fell in one place while fire raged in others. If my eyes were better, they would have picked up on one section in particular. Couldn't see it, but I could feel it. The energy of death that permeated from far away. Of the dead that got up to fight again. Orcs reanimated to fight off more of their kind. The skies above were fighting just as much as the people were down below. Nature itself wasn't sure how to respond, and that only made the chaos build. It got harder and harder to institute my sliver of winter. It wasn't just the normal pushback from the ground and air. It was the pushback from everyone else. Laws were thick in the air. I could feel them pressing against me and had to use my own to ward them off. Ice and wind battled against everything else. It was impossible to pick out what I was fighting off, and instead felt like I was fighting the tide. A battle that had my domain shrinking by the minute. I gave ground instead of holding it to preserve my energy. My wind law helped. The newly realized concept of domination did its best. But it was up against a foe it couldn't beat. The weight of thousands against one. It asserted dominance and created a bastion of winter, but I knew it wouldn't last. Not if I aimed to conserve it. My heart pounded like a drum inside my chest. Each beat sent mana coursing through my veins, urging to be used. It bled from my feet into the land under them, feeding permafrost to freeze and grow. It escaped from my body into the air. Desolate blizzard drank it in to impose itself upon the world. Each beat invigorated my body, and each beat brought power like nothing else. Power to assert my will on the world. Power to stand tall and have the orcs break against me. There was something there. Something about the sensation that called to me, but there wasn't enough to realize. It almost felt like a whisper. It's too soon. The feeling lingered, but I didn't gain anything else from it. I wasn't even sure what it was. The archers did what they could to stall the champions, but they advanced on my position, and I couldn't afford any more distractions. A primal roar resounded out of me as I looked upon my challengers. Challengers that aimed to assert their will over my own. To knock me down and stand victorious over me. Ice ran through my veins as I had the thought. It brought clarity and rage in equal measure. Rage at the thought of losing, and the clarity needed to keep a cool head. Blood-soaked, weapon-charged, snow and frozen bodies coating the ground. It was something I couldn't hold in. Any and all thoughts of those around me dulled as I stood at the vanguard and gave those behind me the best chance I could. Chapter 277 Threat Level. Austin. The small fry were slow enough that he didn't even have to pull on his anchor to kill them. They had strong muscles and their swings were powerful, but they meant nothing if they couldn't hit him. A thrust of his spear with only a few skills was enough to drop them. Plus, none of the blood came back on him. A win-win way to slaughter. The beginning of the wave was rather easy. Dance around and stab as many as he could. It reminded him of the early days of the mantis infestation at the Twins. Before it became a drag and he had to fight progressively harder bugs. The orcs were slower, dumber, and couldn't fly, so he had an easy enough time. First, the hunters had arrows that bested even his speed, and the champions were much tougher to take down. The archers at the wall did their best, but the champions were hardy. Austin felt every time one of Hal's arrows came screaming in, and it usually ended up with a dead champion in its wake. The champions were a miniature Chris, if Austin had to describe it. They forced him to bring his eyes away from the surroundings, and boy was that hard to do. There was just so much happening. Nearly everything that caught his eye was new in some way. New and exciting. There was an honest-to-God necromancer for God's sake. Even after gaining the ability to shoot beams of light from his hands, an actual necromancer was something else. He watched as an orc took an arrow to the chest, fell down dead, death magic flare, for what else could it be dash, and the same orc got back up and fought on for the other side. Austin nearly took an arrow because of the distraction. It was fascinating. The weather was another drag on his attention. If the fighting got any worse, he'd have to lock in and disregard his sightseeing, but his abilities were enough to sneak a peek every once in a while. But it was so hard to ignore. The sun would poke through in a rare gap in the clouds for a brief moment before they shifted, covering the hole up while also opening a different one somewhere else. It felt like a spotlight getting turned off and on while pointing in random directions. It would start to drizzle like it was the onset of a rainstorm, then it would freeze and turn to hail or snow, then suddenly stop altogether, only to return in buckets so forceful they hurt his skin. The wind blew the horrid stench of the blood leaking out of the orcs 1 second, and then the next the only thing he could smell was the ozone of lightning. There was even the beginning of a funnel cloud. Austin had seen some monstrous storms since the change. Storms that caused mana to go wonky and have the force of what used to be classified as a tropical storm or weak hurricane. He'd also witnessed a few law storms, but those were exceedingly rare. The two he had the pleasure of viewing, a blizzard and tornado, were sights to behold, and whatever was happening above was on the verge of becoming his third. Last but not least of the fascinating sights was everyone else fighting. He'd seen Marcus in action before along with the few other powerhouses in his city. Clarissa was the next most noticeable, but she lost some of her flair because of Rachel. It wasn't as novel. But here, with everything going on, there was too much to see. He didn't have enough eyes to take it all in. He may have the eyes of a bird, but they were good at seeing far and clearly, not wide and panoramic. Still, he could pick out a few key areas. They also coincided with the areas Chris pointed out where other suspected barons fought. Those areas flared to his sight like pillars in the sky. It was like being in the vicinity of over a dozen Chris's. Maybe I shouldn't use Chris's as a unit of measurement. He saw one woman clad in earth so thick and dense that it put Jonathan to shame. Her section of the wall was still untouched as she held it nearly single-handedly. She wasn't killing as fast, but she held it firmly. Her name was Jayla, if Austin remembered correctly, and fighting next to her were two more that were fun to watch. On her left, a man with honest-to-God lava dripping off him weaved through the orcs like a bull in a china shop and burned, crushed, or pulverized anything that came his way with his bare fists. Gauntlets wrought from hardened lava coated his hands, which still had glowing veins of cherry red underneath. The man on her left was a one-man tornado with gusts that not only blew everything off their feet but simultaneously ripped them apart. He wasn't as notable as the two next to him, but he stood out. Those three were the tip of the iceberg. It felt like every other second his eyes were pulled in a different direction. Lightning bolts thicker than he was rained down. Water scythes spanning tens of feet wide that bisected dozens of orcs. Fires that burned so hot that it hurt to look at from even as far away as he was. Even standing next to Chris and his winter wonderland, his body imagined sweltering when he gazed upon it. There was too much for him to take in, and as the fight got rougher, he had to pour more and more of his attention into not dying. Not dying was his preferable state, and no amount of fascination was going to cause his death. That would just be stupid. The Admiral. He stood and watched. The section of wall he gazed out from rattled slightly from the impact, but it stood none worse for wear after the orc champion died. It shouldn't have gotten through the line in the first place. Inspire troops, tactical command, empowering command, division leader, all of his army boosting skills were in play, and it still wasn't enough. He had yet to take the field personally, but the time was coming for him to have to. If anything stronger than the champions and hunters came, his hand would be forced. His skills would weaken from not being able to see the full picture, and so many people would die. Some days he hated his class. Hated the fact he had to sit and watch as his men died. But it was the best choice of shitty choices. His late wife would curse his foul language, but there was no other way to put it. It was torture. He rose up from a position not unsimilar to the men out laying their lives on the line now. From seaman to captain, and eventually, after years of service, admiral. Yet the best he could do right now was stand and watch his men die. His personal strength wasn't enough to outweigh the good he was doing. As sad as it was. Not yet, at least. Sir. Section 4 is getting pushed back and needs reinforcements. A runner informed. Send the 8th and the 9th. The admiral responded after looking at the section with insightful battlefield view. The skill wasn't working at its best, but it was all he had. He was running out of reserve troops. The few he'd kept back for occasions such as this were quickly getting deployed. The teams he'd spent the better part of 2 years piecing together were doing the best they could, and it wasn't enough. If this was as bad a test as they faced, they'd win. Being an admiral, he didn't have extensive experience with land-based combat, but he had enough. He also had officers of the army folded into his command that could make up the difference. All of them were predicting a close victory. They'd lose many, but they wouldn't be defeated. That was all based on the enemies they knew about. The regular orcs that came first and the hunters and campions that came next. It didn't account for the unknown. Their skills could do much, but they weren't omnipotent. Sure, there were plans drawn up for what could be anticipated, but those couldn't account for everything. It was impossible. He also didn't know the capability of those around him. It wasn't like he could go up to the other faction leaders and demand to know their combat abilities. Planning for this test was like going into it with one eye blind. Oh, he sure wanted to wring from them everything they could do and get the full picture, but he couldn't. He barely made it through the squabbling mess his previous meeting was without hitting anyone. He wanted to strangle some of them, let alone work with them. Without knowledge of what they might face and incomplete knowledge of the abilities of their own side, planning was meaningless. Too many unknown variables made even the most generic of plans untenable. That wasn't even taking into account the more esoteric powers. Some literally got stronger when faced with a disadvantaged position. A class dedicated to being the underdog, or skills that got stronger when faced with a mounting challenge. With only 2 years to discover, categorize, and research their new reality, there just wasn't enough time. Tactical classes covered for that weakness, but they could only mend it so much. His own class did most of the heavy lifting, but it still wasn't enough. Sir, report on the Stormbringer. A runner handed him a sheet of paper. They weren't wasteful enough to have messengers and runners transporting paper supplies around the battlefield. The sheet was conjured from a skill. The feel was different enough from real paper to tell, but it looked identical. They'd even discovered that some conjured materials this way had anti-espionage qualities, somehow making it harder to read if you weren't the intended recipient. Nick Castillo. Designation: the Stormbringer. Large lightning bolts that can kill champions and hunters in one shot. Mana levels: unknown. Laws: lightning tier 2, water tier 2, wind tier 1. Mana cultivation at stage 1. Body: unknown. Spirit: unknown. Skills can also chain to surrounding targets. Men behind him are above average with few standouts. Level: 97. Profession: unknown. Categorization: high damage mage. Threat level: high. It wasn't the first of such messages to come in. Those close to where he stood were the first to be scouted. It took longer and longer for the information to come in as they had to travel further and further through the chaos the area had become. It was surface-level information at best, with more unknowns than he cared for, but it was better than nothing. An extensive skill list, pinpoint accuracy on stats, every step they had taken, whether it be mind, body, or spirit. That was the kind of information he would kill for, but no one would give up. Not willingly, at least. He wasn't only gathering this for future use. Yes, this kind of information was essential to making any future plans, but it had a very real use now that outweighed anything it could be used for later. Any skill related to tactics or planning depended on knowing what those you commanded could do. The Stormbringer wasn't under his command and didn't benefit from his skills, but that didn't mean the information was worthless. Any battle plan that was drawn up relied on accurate information, and the closer it was to the truth, the more accurate it would become. It helped decide where they would send troops, where they would support or give ground. If other factions showed the ability to withstand the orcs, they could shift forces away and bring them to where they were needed. Another runner came up and dropped off another paper. Christopher Zelensky. Designation: Iceman. Heavily armored warrior using a large warhammer. Layer of ice as well as plate underneath. Estimated strength well over 1,000. Creates a domain of ice around him that debilitates anything close. Laws: Ice Tier 2. Wind Tier 2. Mana cultivation at Stage 1. Body wood at minimum. Spirit. Anchor formation. Notables in faction: Water Mage of high level. Fire Mage of high level. Stone Warrior of high level. Light or Solar Warrior of high level. Level: 95. Profession: Unknown. Categorization: High Strength and High Defense Warrior. Threat level: High. Chapter 278. I couldn't. Chris. I wasn't quite sure when it all went to shit. It seemed like every fight or wave that extended past a few hours and caused Avalanche to max out eventually ended like shit. With a fight taking that long, mistakes were inevitable. Fatigue and exhaustion both put their hands on the scale after that, and skill and perseverance could only do so much to balance it. It was only a matter of time before it came crashing down. My hammer was chipped. I felt it clearly as it happened. The blood-soaked ice hammerhead had been worn down. The inherent magic did what it could to protect it, and I felt my own mana being used, but it wasn't enough. Not when it was so saturated in corrosive energies that got continually renewed. 1 or 2 enemies would have been fine. My hammer would have smashed them to smithereens and been no worse off. Sure, it would have had to fight off the accumulated blood, but there was enough power dwelling inside the hammer it would have been fine. Even 10 to 20 foes would have been fine. Maybe even 100. Not the amount I was facing. That was too much for the weapon. My muscles strained as it pulled the heavy hammer through the air, but it filled me with righteous satisfaction to watch as the orcs deformed so greatly that if it wasn't an instant death, they wished for it. Avalanche pushed my strength to new heights, and even though I was trying to hold back, a mere tap tore bloody holes through their flesh, which only caused the blood problem to get worse. When chest cavities busted upon my hammer like a grotesque balloon, there was only so much I could do to keep my weapon free from the corrosive liquid, which was not much. My armor was wearing down as well. Frost armor pulled more and more mana to maintain, and it started to break off and crack more easily. The structure not as firm. In the back of my head, there had been a chime different than a kill notification, and my armor resisted better. I hadn't even noticed, my focus so intent on the slaughter. I fought on, for there was nothing else I could do. Giving up wasn't in my nature, and I sure as shit wasn't going to let myself be overrun. Not now, not ever. The crack came suddenly. Both hands propelled the hammer through the air and smashed it down onto a champion in my sight when the vile blood weakened it enough. The rent was comparatively small when in proportion to the rest of the hammer. Tiny even, but it used my own tactics against me. The same plan we used to deal with the boss monster of the Barren Wave, where we used a small cut to continually dig deeper using fire and ice. Instead, it was blood seeking to destroy my hammer one small crack at a time. The rent opened up a new area for the blood to go, and it wasn't long until more of the small cracks were made. More yet after they were filled with the corruptive energies. I did what I could, but it was a losing battle from the start. As long as there was more blood to flow, it would continue to eat away at my weapon. And there was more blood to flow. I wasn't sure what the extent of Frostbound hammer was. Frostbound hammer, legendary, a splinter of the weapon once wielded by the Jotnar king Thiassi thousands of years ago. The ice this hammer was forged from still holds some of his spirit and must be awakened to show its true power. combine with other splinters to bring back its full might. Only given to the mightiest of warriors with a strong ice affinity and bound to you in frost once summoned. I'd used it for years. It had been by my side for countless battles, and I still hadn't discovered all its secrets. I knew I could feel where it was. The link between us allowed for that much, but I wasn't sure how far that went. The other part about it being a weapon wielded by someone else had no bearing on me. I didn't know who Thiassi was. I wasn't even sure what a Jotnar king was exactly, but I could make an educated guess. If the system was giving out a fragment of his hammer as a legendary skill, it had to be someone powerful, but how powerful? It held some of his spirit. What did that mean exactly? Right now, as it cracked and splintered, it felt like a part of me was cracking and splintering, like my arm was slowly being ground apart, bound to me in frost. It seemed that the connection was more than just being able to locate it. This was the first time I'd been conscious when my weapon was damaged. The only other time was when the explosion destroyed it, but I wasn't awake to feel it. I was awake now and it hurt. I'd poured everything I had into the weapon when I summoned it. All I could. My mana, my spirit, and my laws. All of it. And it was slowly getting pulled apart at the seams. If this was happening to my beloved hammer, it was happening everywhere. The metal of swords were breaking down. Axes and maces were deteriorating. If this fight continued, everyone would be without a weapon to fight with. It didn't spell well for what was to come, but that wasn't something I could change, and it wasn't something I could do anything about. I had to push the thought out of my head. My hammer, my foes, and the battlefield in front of me were all that mattered. Not even the chimes in my head. Sinking to intuition over trying and failing to fight off the corrosive blood, I did the only thing that came to mind. I flooded the area with desolate blizzard. I leaned and pushed on my ice law to drive temperatures as low as I could go. The blood fought what I was trying to do. It didn't like being altered, even if the temperature around it demanded that it freeze. It laughed in the face of science. It didn't care that I was blasting it with temperatures so low that it should have frozen 3 times over. It fought the ice mana trying to freeze it. Fought the law behind the mana empowering such concepts. How it did that was a mystery I couldn't think about right now. I could only push harder. Using considerably more power than it should have, the blood around me started to freeze solid. Layer upon layer on my hammer was the first to freeze. My mana coursing through it amplified by its inherent properties. As I saw that my plan worked, I yanked with ice manipulation. It wasn't gentle and it wasn't delicate. With the might of my full abilities and mind, I wrenched the blood off my weapon. Another chime. Cracked apart, some sections trying to stay stuck, but I was relentless. I yanked the corrupted ice off in sheets, and as new blood froze, I did the same. The ice fought my influence. The only other time I'd had someone fight for influence over my ice was when sparring with Gabriel. This was worse. Still, I couldn't allow it to continue. I wouldn't be powerless without my hammer, but I would take a hit. Not least of which because of the pain involved. I'd been beaten up before. Crushed and speared through. Sliced and cut. Lost a finger, an arm, and an eye. Broken damn near every bone in my body. Pain wasn't new to me. It was an old friend. But that didn't mean it didn't hurt. I used it to fuel my anger. My rage. Righteous fury wanted to activate. It was rearing back and ready to go. It wished to be let out, and I let it. Its boost washed over me, and I started slaughtering all the faster. My legs pumped that much more strength into my swings. My arms dragged my cracked hammer that much faster through the air. I'd long gotten used to the side effect of the skill, but it was times like this that I let it cloud my head. It dulled the pain, but I let it do just enough to not hinder me. A mindless brute was the last thing I wanted to become. I noticed the orcs getting stronger. The champions became more and more frequent, and arrows from hunters were flying regularly now. Our side fought back. Arrows and spells were endless in their destruction. I couldn't see where the front line had gone. The warriors who had stood at my side either retreated or died. Only a few still stood, but I couldn't spare a glance to look back and count. Austin still lived as his light shone brightly. Jonathan, as well as the earth, rumbled under my feet. I could feel the steadfast fountain of power he was pulling on. His anchor was undeniable. I only feared that it would be literal. I couldn't even spare thoughts for my family. Wind howled as I had to pull on it. Arrows that would have landed started to soar by instead. My wind just enough to blow them off course. The champions were strong enough that the wind did basically nothing, but it worked to cut down on arrows impacting me. I had a few arrow shafts sticking out of me from precise shots, and I didn't care to add any more. The shafts were broken to nubs as the fight continued, but I could still feel the arrowhead inside me. It tore skin and muscles as I moved. If I hadn't refined my body to stone, it would have been a lot worse, but they could only go so deep. My organs were safe, and it was a mild nuisance at best, but the pain added up. Champions approached me in pairs, then trios, then groups. The ratio was now entirely elite that poured out of the obelisk. The alien construction invisible through the chaos. Even in the middle of the day, it was impossible to see. My hammer killed them all. My ice couldn't do it. Couldn't stand the onslaught of so many. Not unless I poured more mana than I was willing to in the skills. My bloodline burned through my veins as I tapped into more power. Avalanche reached its peak, and it wasn't enough to keep up with the gradual increase in difficulty. I was at my peak. It was as far as I could go. My bloodline, Avalanche, Fury, all burning as bright as they could go. The only thing that could any further was Glacial Presence. And I couldn't waste the mana to get it there. Avalanche doubled my physical stats. Righteous Fury pushed them 22.5% higher. Glacial Presence currently teetered around a 20% boost. Felt like I was tearing apart at the seams. If my body had been wood, I wasn't sure I'd be able to handle it. A body wasn't meant to be pushed as far as I was pushing. It was why boosting skills weren't stacked to infinity. Why someone couldn't stand in front of 100 supports and be invincible. The only reason I hadn't already pulled myself apart was because of my body of stone and my high fortitude. My bloodline also worked double duty, strengthening and fortifying my body. Still, it felt like I was on fire even though my entire body was ice cold. Slowly burning out. My hammer splintered again. My body strained. My mind pushed harder to freeze everything around me. All sensory details were lost as I had too much to focus on. I smashed and I smashed and I smashed. My hammer reaped lives at a speed the Grim Reaper would weep at. It howled as the air struggled to get out of its way. My muscles ripped, tore, and burned to keep its flight steady and destructive. Frost built around me for no other reason than it had to. My bloodline plunged my body into sub-zero temperatures, and instead of working up heat as I exerted myself, I cooled even further. As I pulled and pulled on my bloodline. As my mana heart pumped Arctic mana through my veins. As I pulled on my law to cool the area around me. It was inevitable. It was destined. The corruption couldn't stop it. Could only delay it. I smashed. The frost built. The shouting and cries from others fell away. I didn't even have the reassuring flashes of light that Austin was still alive. I couldn't feel the rumble under my feet caused by Jonathan ripping up the earth. I couldn't feel the water drilling down from behind me that my sister provided. Couldn't. I smashed. I stood my ground and smashed. Crushed. Killed so swiftly and utterly my eyes barely registered the object in front of me before my hammer tore through it. A cry of primal pain ripped through me. My hammer shattered. The shaft splintering in my hands and the head shooting off in pieces. The head of ice so cold that it caused frostbite from a touch shattered and went flying through the air in directions unknown. Bodies dropped further away, but I couldn't. My hands bled from the muck covering them. It had pooled and saturated through my ice and gauntlets, and the blood now contacted my skin. My spirit wavered after my hammer broke. It felt like a piece of me was ripped out and stomped on. The pain was great, but I couldn't. My hands formed bloody fists and my savagery continued. I didn't need a hammer to leverage my strength. Over 4,000 points of it now. My hands blew holes through chests. They vaporized heads. They wrought the same destruction my hammer would have. Ice coalesced and formed into a club. I couldn't form it into something better and could only resort to a club. It soared through the air and shattered upon an orc champion. The shards drove deep into its flesh and it fell convulsing to the ground next to the thousands of others. Another club formed and the same result. I smashed. I destroyed. I stood and broke everything that came near. The frost around me turned a murky black. The blood under me froze into disgusting shards of ice. I yelled and screamed. I roared my defiance to no one and everyone. To the one person that mattered. Myself. I pulled on my anchor. I pulled on my bloodline. I pulled on everything I could to remain standing. To remain in front of the tide that would harm those behind me. But even that wasn't the biggest reason. I pulled and pulled to stand victorious when this was all over. My body destroyed itself slowly because I still stood. Chapter 279, Fury of the Naiad. Abigail. Lightning flashed and thunder boomed with the force of 1,000 cannons. The rain danced around her and leapt to her touch. It whipped down, shot out in jets, and cut through the earth in large scythes. She cut down every orc in sight, but it still wasn't enough. Water manipulation was pushed to the limit. Her brain strained to keep up with what she was ordering of it. It had to keep up. The wall shook and parts of stone rained down. It shook again before the orc chieftain was defeated. After the hunters and champions came the chieftains. They were larger, stronger, and all around more deadly than before. It took longer for her water to cut through them. They towered over the normal orcs that were sent to soften them up at the beginning. Those orcs were already slaughtered and driven into the muddy ground where thousands fought upon their dead bodies. Thousands of dead. Human dead. Hours of people dying. The field was filled with the bodies of the fallen, but the rest fought on through the hours regardless. The rain had long since turned the ground harrowing. If it hadn't, the ocean of blood would have. Instead, it was a murky red sea that was half water, half blood, and half whatever else dragged into the mess. Her hair glowed in an array of spirited blues and fluttered out behind her. The one good thing about calling on her bloodline, getting her hair out of her face. It defied both gravity and physics, as it should be sticking to her skin and matted down by the rain, but it flowed through the air in streams. She didn't like using it too often as she wasn't accustomed to the side effects yet. She'd reached too far. She thought herself stronger, and it was still difficult to not be affected by emotions and thoughts that weren't hers. But she needed it now. Rachel, focus on the right flank. Abigail called out. 2 chieftains were heading in that direction. Hal, focus on the left. Her core strained at the amount of mana she was pulling from the air and using. She split attention to both gather it and use it at the same time. The water mana was abundant from both the river at her back, the rain falling from the sky. It pleased her bloodline to have ready access to such lively sources of water. Fresh water as well. An emotion she didn't mind having, but it still wasn't hers. Arrows packed with force outdoing even the orc hunters rifled through the air, splitting the rain around it slammed home on their left flank and fires raged on their right. Just as she was strained, Rachel and Hal were both strained and they didn't have the option to rip the mana from the air. Fire mana wasn't abundant. Not on their side at least. The thick columns of smoke were raging across the battlefield. But not here. Water snuffed any flame out. As it should. The orcs had spilled out of the obelisk for hours and there was only so much longer they could fight. There had already been those who fell after running out of mana or stamina. Warriors driven long past where their bodies could handle. Mages passing out from depleting too much mana. All to last that much longer. It was endless. How John was still out there fighting was a constant worry, and it was one she couldn't focus on for long. Chris was an even bigger problem. They hadn't seen him in over an hour. The last sighting had him holding his ground out in front, but the smoke, haze, darkness, and worsening conditions made visibility impossible. The regular and consistent blasts of cold and Arctic mana were comforting, but even that had disappeared, either drowned out by everything else or something much worse, but she couldn't focus on that. Even the bodies had stopped. His hammer had the side effect of launching whatever he hit flying when his full strength was behind it, which was always when he fought for long enough. With all his boosts, bodies rained down broken and disfigured when he hit them just right. Although it was gruesome, it was reassuring to know he was still alive. But that had stopped and no more bodies rained. Mayor, Marcus is being driven back. His southern flank is wavering. Those who were out of mana fought through the exhaustion and headaches to act as runners. They ran all over to bring her information, and all of it was bad. Not one good thing came out of this test. Not one. I'll go. Stay here. A gust of wind tore through the wall, and before Abigail could raise objections, her mother was off. She'd been a literal whirlwind, helping wherever she was needed. Her mother was skilled and had the levels and power to back her up, but she didn't have the upfront stopping power of other members of her family. Instead of staying in one spot and holding it against all odds, she traveled around and helped where she was needed. Her wins helped facilitate that. It also made Abigail's job just that much easier, but it was still a big enough job that her mind was on fire. A flash of light heralded another family member she hadn't seen in too long. "Austin, what's the situation?" she yelled. He huffed and bent over, trying to catch his breath and speak at the same time. I can't any longer." Water and blood poured off him, and if it hadn't been raining, he'd be soaked in sweat instead. His body held a simmering glow from extensive power use or from his bloodline. Probably both. Steam wafted up from the residual heat from his head. His helmet long lost to the fight. His face was scarred and blood trickled down a few newer wounds, but she couldn't waste her mana on healing right now. "Austin!" she screamed. "What's going on?" She couldn't allow time for him to recover. She needed to know what he knew now. "They're still coming," Huff, with no end in sight. "I saw them still pouring out," Huff, "but nothing bigger than the chieftains." Austin used to be out front picking off the elites, but he'd long ago run out of steam. His anchor was dry and his mana was petering. His skin was an angry red and flaking off, almost peeling in an extreme sunburn kind of way. He drew too long on his boosting skills. "I need you with Rachel on the right." Hopefully, their synergy would help them conserve what little they had left in the tank. "Abigail, I can't." He faltered and nearly fell. "I've got nothing left." She knew that. She saw that with her eyes, her mana, and her healing experience. She knew what state he was in but asked it of him anyway. Even his equipment spoke of the state he was in. His armor was torn, punctured, and chipping apart from the vile blood. Hastily healed wounds visible through the holes. His spear, the spear Vinny and Chris were so proud of, chipped and cracked. It was a miracle it wasn't broken completely. It was also why his mana was sucked dry. Extending every attack to preserve his spear would make every kill take that much more. "Austin!" She grabbed his chest straps and lifted him up. "I don't care if you have to use a stick from the ground. We need you out there. If the wall fell, we need to push." A call rang out. She shot out another jet of pressurized water at a charging chieftain and looked down at the wall. Every warrior down below had either died or retreated. Everyone but Chris and John. Chris because he wouldn't and John because he couldn't. John was the only thing keeping the wall from being overrun. Without anyone to drive the fight away from the wall, the bodies built up at the base. Enough of them created a ramp of sorts. A way for the orcs to easily climb up and over their only fortification. The only thing saving them, which made clearing the bodies a priority. "Water!" Her order rang and nearly every water mage stopped what they were doing. She reached at the river behind them, the murky brown water from the muddy banks, and pulled. Her and every other water mage pulled together. A tidal wave rose up and over where they stood before crashing down on the other side of the wall. The force of thousands of gallons of water violently pushed everything away. The piles of dead, the ramp of bodies, even the charging orcs. Everything was swept away by the weight of so much rushing water. The wall was cleared for the moment, until it built up again and another tidal wave would be required. A few mages dropped. The strain of pulling so much water their last straw. Healers ran up and down the wall pulling those away. The medical centers and tents were already overrun. The nature of the blight made healing wounds that much harder. The first who had fallen had made their way back into the fight already, but those who returned became fewer and fewer. Healers were running out of everything. Mana for skills, healing herbs, bandages, potions, and salves. Everything they had packed or their alchemists had made for the fight had been used. No one had anticipated fighting for so long. No one had anticipated the injuries to be so many. Nearly every person had sustained a wound of some kind or had gotten blood on them. A cut, scrape, stab, anything. Healers ran triage as best they could, but there were too many people hurt and not enough people to heal them. Abigail wished for it to end, prayed for it to end. The great druid fell. A runner shouted, "The north wall is breached." She'd known the faction to their north was in a rough shape, but this threw a wrench into everything they had planned. A runner an hour ago came with news of them being pushed back. But this was so much worse. The roots from the druid were the only thing keeping their wall from falling, and after he died. "Change of plans, Austin," she yelled at the man who still hadn't moved. "Hold the north. The trench will help, but if they get behind us." "Abigail." She expected him to say he couldn't. She expected, "I won't be able to do it alone." His hunched form straightened for a second. He pulled together the dregs he had left. He was right. He wouldn't be able to do it alone. "Gabriel. Alice. Go with him." Her brother looked at her with concern. Their family was spread along the line with a few in each spot, but most were located far from the center. Chris was single-handedly lessening the impact for the middle of their line. It allowed them to send people elsewhere to where they were needed. The flanks were getting hit the hardest, so the strong went there. Elliot, Hal, John, and Rachel held the flanks. Although the center was thinner than elsewhere, they had fewer defenders to compensate. Gabriel and Alice were her only backup now that her mother had left. Both ice mages were her only support near her level, and she was sending them away. "Abigail, no," Gabriel started. He'd been slinging ice for as long as she had, his phantom tails waving behind him. "You won't be able to hold this alone. It won't matter if we get surrounded." She yelled harshly, "Hold the north, Gabe. I'll be fine." All three knew that probably wasn't true. Yet they left all the same. The threat of getting surrounded was too great. With no end in sight, and thousands of orcs still charging at them, she would have to hold the center for as long as she could. Her bloodline and mana against endless foes. It was a good thing she still had a little left in the tank. Her dread at drawing too deeply on her bloodline left just enough for her use now. She threw her reservations to the wind and drew deeply on the energy deep inside her. The well of power that she had left as unperturbed as possible. A glowing orb of vibrant blue. It was thicker than water, but its essence teemed with the feeling of rushing streams and raging rivers. It was the essence of flowing water in an orb. Both the life-bringing qualities of moving water and the destructive qualities it could so easily turn into. Her hair deepened in color and flowed more harshly as she leaned into the destruction. The rage. The rising waters of a river tearing everything away. The destruction from flash floods. The death that something so lively could bring. Naiads were usually depicted as childlike and joyful, full of vibrant energy, but they could also be the bringers of destruction. Wroth with hate and anger that could so easily turn a once lovely stream into something so much worse. That essence, the essence of the Naiad, flowed through her, and she pulled on the water around her. The water saturating the ground, the water falling from the air, the water at her back, and she wove it into something so terribly destructive. With the fury of a Naiad, Abigail drowned all that she could and prayed for it to end. Chapter 280 War Leaders. Jayla POV. "Ma'am, we need to retreat. The wall is lost." Stone reached out and crushed another orc as she vented her anger. Her command structure was new, and without Walter, it wasn't up to her standard. It didn't help that so many had died and new people had to slide in to replace them. "The wall will not fall," she ground out in frustration. "We will not retreat." She'd spent days going over the wall, fortifying the stone, joining the blocks together. It wasn't going to fall. Not when her 2 feet were still anchored to the ground. Mana poured out of her at an alarming rate to keep the stone sturdy. The blood upon its surface was eating away at its integrity. Her professional skills from creating the wall were slowly getting washed away, one stray drop of blood at a time. She wasn't alone in her efforts to keep the wall intact, and there were dozens of others fighting off the corruption. But if this didn't end soon, they were going to lose. It didn't much matter if the wall was lost at that point. They would all be dead anyway. Where's Travis? She hadn't seen him in a while and he was supposed to be helping her. The last she'd felt the taint of fire was nearly an hour ago. Fighting deeper in, his skills wrecked the area and he started to damage his own people. She didn't know who answered. What about Devin? She asked. She hadn't known Devin long, but they'd come together with Travis. The three of them had an alliance of sorts to face this threat together. It helped they were all close enough together that traveling together was easier than separately. His winds were annoying, but they were powerful. Devin's dead. He died? He may not be as sturdy as her, but he was a baron. There was a strength required to receive that title, yet he had already fallen. What of his faction? He was supposed to be defending the section to the south. Travis held the north and she was in the middle. If Devin had fallen, they didn't have anyone strong enough to defend their portion of the wall. Getting pushed back. They'll lose the wall in less than an hour without him. Jayla could change that. She had skills and abilities she hadn't taken out yet, but she had to weigh the worth. If she held his wall, his faction would have something to fight behind. They wouldn't continually lose ground, but it would weaken hers. If she had to spread her protection further, her own wall would suffer. It would drain her faster and it would cost her. If she did, and the fight continued, she'd fall the same as Devin had. I can't. She wanted to. She desperately wanted to, but she couldn't. As much as the thought of leaving his faction to their fates angered and saddened her, there was nothing she could do. If Travis fell too, they would be screwed. Instead, she started planning for the inevitable fall of Devin's faction. Either through retreat or death, she had to be ready. The earth rushed up through her feet and the ground started to shift. Every other time she'd grasped its power, it had been reluctant. Hard to change and harder still to alter, but not this time. It was relatively eager compared to her efforts before. She wove it through the wall under her feet and spread it throughout its length. The wall strengthened and spikes shot out from its bottom, skewering the orcs trying to climb it or break it down. Jayla used the very wall she stood upon to fight for her. It was both to push the bodies away and to kill anything too close. When was the last time I had to do that? The battle had gone on for hours at this point and her mind wasn't as sharp. Details started to mix together and exhaustion was rearing its head. Feels like it's been longer than before. Garrett. Without Walter, Garrett was the person she trusted most. Him being a healer meant he was probably still alive. They weren't on the front lines holding the top of the wall where the most casualties were. Yes. Is it just me? Or are the orcs slowing? The prattle in the beginning were easy enough to smash or crush. That got harder when the champions started pounding on her wall, but it was still easy enough for her power to deny them. The chieftains were when the difficulties arose. They hit like meteors upon the wall, heavy and quick with their weapons. Not even the beast she'd fought to get her Baroness title was as hard as defending against the chieftains together. Garrett ran up the wall and looked out over the battlefield in front of them. Jayla had gazed out to confirm her theory, but she didn't want to be wrong. She didn't want to give herself hope. Her words were heard by more than just Garrett, and she saw more and more people came to the same realization as she had. The orcs are breaking. They're slowing. Any attempts to prevent false hope were thoroughly thrashed. Everyone picked up on what was said, and it spread quicker than wildfire. It was the second wind that some people needed. The small reassurance that the battle wasn't a lost cause. Jayla knew better. This wasn't the end. She'd thought that during the barren wave and nearly died. This wasn't the end. The test wasn't over. A massive wave of baleful aura crashed out from the obelisk. It washed over everything like a tsunami, smothering everything nearby, and everything felt it. Arr. What followed was a bone-rattling roar. It put the rumbling thunder overhead to shame. It caused it to cower, as it seized the air and forced it to tremble. Roar, it was mirrored a moment later by a roar matching its own. Roar, then another. Roar, then another. Jayla should have seen that coming. There were 4 sides. There were 4 of whatever was coming. The Admiral POV. His halberd bit into the chieftain and cleaved through its chest, shearing it near in 2. He leapt back and attacked the next chieftain before its blood could rain down. He'd been caught too many times by it to make the error again. The next chieftain fell and he ripped his weapon free and did it again. And again. His men were dying and that was all he had to think of to keep moving forward. So many had perished. So many that he felt breathe their last. Fueled him. Gave his muscles strength when all they wanted to do was falter. Sharpened his mind when all it wanted to do was turn to mush. Of the teams he'd painstakingly handpicked and trained, over most were shattered apart. Totaled together, nearly half were dead. There wasn't time to shuffle and accommodate. They fought with what they had. Hendricks fought not far away, eyes ablaze and sword deteriorating. Gonzalez at his side, muscles rippling and teeth bared, leaning into the animalistic instincts of his bloodline. The bear of a man was riddled with blackened wounds, but he stayed fighting. Priscilla, a once dignified and decorated staff sergeant, stood covered in blood and gore over her fallen team. Her spear danced and brought death to those who had felled them. His heart tore, but that wasn't for the here and now. No, what would be grieved later. They were at war and the battle had to be won, no matter the cost. "Sir!" a fighter shouted from the wall behind him. "Reports state the obelisk is slowing down." "What? Report now." He faced down two more chieftains while listening to the information. "Scouts say the rate disgorged is slowing. It's now a trickle compared to before." "You have visual confirmation?" He hoped they did. They wouldn't be bringing this to him if they didn't, but he had to ask. "Yes, sir. But there's a problem," the fighter shouted. "Reports say the obelisk is building in strength." "What? Why would it build in strength if the number of orcs was decreasing?" His tactical skills quickly spit out a few reasons. The strength of the obelisk had increased in sharp spikes twice already. When the champions and hunters started coming through and when the chieftains started coming through. The only difference those times was the number of orcs wasn't affected. The strength of the obelisk increased and the strength of the orcs increased. His skill warned him. They shouted at him, but even they weren't prepared for the earth-shaking roar followed by three others. The sky-splitting sound rattled through his body and brought a fear he'd long thought dead. A second runner came flying in as fast as his feet could carry him. "Sir!" For orc war leaders spotted. The admiral didn't even ask for a level. Every single orc spat out of the accursed obelisk was exactly level 100. Even though the power between the regular orcs and the orc chieftains was enormous, they were both the same level. If these war leaders were any different, that would have been the first thing mentioned. The fact it hadn't meant they were similarly level 100. How something could be that powerful and still be in the same rank as them was mind-boggling, but it was fact. He could feel them from here. The pressure was palpable and the fear was very real. He didn't need a report to know where they were. They broadcasted that like giant neon pillars. The four war leaders were all headed in different directions. One was headed south, right toward where he stood. It was closing in at a remarkable pace that could only mean it was actively seeking him out. Zuri and Liam were close by, but it felt like he was the one being targeted rather than them. Another shot west, the third went north, and the last went east. The war leaders sprang out of all four sides of the obelisk and rushed toward the strongest defenders they could locate. He stuttered to remember who was all stationed in the line of the war leaders. The entire section map was out of reach as it was far too much to remember, but he dedicated time to know where the notables were. He'd met Zuri and Liam before when they were liberating the coast, so they'd chosen sections close to him, and he hoped they would be of aid. Who defended the west were unknowns. They'd come from far away and they had no knowledge of them beforehand. They came as a trio and had all chosen sections next to each other in the west. Mountainside, Yellowstone, and Mile High. The north was a mix of knowns and unknowns. They'd heard tale of the Stormbringer before, but the other two were mysteries. Especially the one they suspected, now confirmed to be a necromancer. The east were two more unknowns. They were suspected to be from the far north. One in Minnesota and the other even further than that. The Great Lakes Alliance was also in the east, but those two stood out more. Other factions were spread thoroughly around, but those were the first to come to mind and the only ones he suspected had the strength to stand up to the war leaders. He couldn't think about the other directions, he had to focus on his own first. Hendricks, Gonzalez, Priscilla, We have incoming, he ordered and turned back to the runners, bringing him news. Go get Zuri and Liam. Liam's dead, sir. Fuck. Get Zuri then. The aura thickened and he knew the fates were readying his thread. End of chapter 280.